You've got the wrong room. This isn't a yoga class." An instructor laughed when he saw Claire walk into the dojo in a faded hoodie and worn-out canvas bag. A black belt chimed in, "Let her try, we could use a laugh." The students burst out clapping, expecting a show. Claire said, "Just one line, I just need to try one move." And seconds later, when the black belt lay on the floor, blood pouring from his nose, the dojo fell silent. No one understood what had just happened. Claire stood there, her soft brown hair falling loose over her shoulders, her face bare of any makeup, her eyes steady. She didn't smile, didn't flinch, didn't even look at the guy on the ground. The room was frozen like someone had hit a pause on a movie. The instructor, a wiry guy with a buzz cut and a smirk that hadn't quite faded, stared at her like she'd just grown wings. The students still holding their sparring gloves stopped whispering. Claire's canvas bag sat by the edge of the mat, frayed at the straps, looking like it had been through a war zone. Nobody moved to help the black belt up. Nobody said a word. A woman in a sleek black tracksuit, her nails painted a glossy red, stepped forward, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Wow, nice trick. Did you learn that in some back alley self-defense class?" She tilted her head, her earrings glinting under the dojo's fluorescent lights. The other students snickered, emboldened by her confidence. Claire's fingers tightened briefly on the strap of her bag, but her face stayed calm. She looked at the woman, not with anger, but with a quiet intensity that made the air feel heavy. "I learned it somewhere. You wouldn't last a day," she said, her voice even, like she was stating a fact. The woman's smirk faltered, and she took a half step back, her nails tapping nervously against her arm. She adjusted her stance, just a slight shift of her weight, and the room seemed to shrink around her. The instructor, whose name tag read Mike, cleared his throat, trying to take back control. "All right, lady, that was something, but you can't just walk in here and start swinging." His voice had an edge, like he was embarrassed, but didn't want to admit it. A couple of students nodded, their confidence creeping back. One of them, a guy with a man bun and a shiny new guy, snorted. "What's with the outfit? You look like you're here to clean the place." The others laughed, but it was nervous, like they were testing the air. Claire didn't answer right away. She bent down, picked up her bag, and slung it over her shoulder. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like she was counting every step. "I didn't come to swing," she said, her voice low, but clear, like she was talking to a friend over coffee. "I just needed to see if I still had it." The man bun guy rolled his eyes, but the instructor's face changed, like he'd caught something in her tone. He stepped closer, his hands on his hips. "Had what? You think you're some kind of pro?" The room buzzed again, the students leaning in, ready for round 2 of whatever this was. Before we go further, guys, I just want to take a second. If this story's hitting you, maybe you've been judged, maybe you've been laughed at, maybe you've had to stand there and take it. Could you do me a favor? Pull out your phone, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. It means the world to keep sharing stories like Claire's stories that remind us who we are. All right, let's get back to it. The black belt on the floor, Jason groaned and rolled onto his side, one hand clutching his nose. Blood dripped through his fingers, staining the mat. A couple of students finally rushed over, but they moved like they were scared to get too close. Jason was big, over 6 feet, with arms like tree trunks from years of MMA training. He'd been the dojo's golden boy, the one who bragged about his amateur fights and his undefeated streak. Now he was just a guy trying not to choke on his own blood. "She got lucky," he muttered, his voice thick. "That was a cheap shot." A teenage girl with braces and a nervous laugh stepped forward to her phone, already out filming. "Oh my God, this is going viral," she said, giggling as she zoomed in on Jason's bloody face. "You're gonna be famous for all the wrong reasons, dude." The other students laughed, but it was mean-spirited, like they were piling on just because they could. Claire's eyes flicked to the girl, and for a moment her fingers paused on the zipper of her bag. "Put the phone down," she said, her voice soft but sharp like a blade hidden in silk. The girl froze, her giggles dying in her throat, and slowly lowered her phone, her face flushed with embarrassment. Claire didn't look at Jason. She was already walking toward the center of the mat, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the polished floor. The instructor Mike held up a hand. Hold on. You can't just, nobody said you could fight. Who even are you?" His tone was sharp now, like he was trying to save face in front of his students. A woman in the back with blonde highlights and a tight ponytail crossed her arms. "Yeah, what's your deal? You don't just walk into a dojo and start breaking noses?" Her voice was all attitude, like she was auditioning for a reality show. The air in the dojo thickened as a man in a tailored jacket, clearly not a student, leaned against the wall, watching Claire with a smug grin. He was the kind of guy who carried himself like he owned the place. Probably a sponsor or a local big shot who liked to throw his weight around. "This is cute," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But seriously, kid, you're out of your league. Why don't you go back to wherever you got that thrift store hoodie?" His laugh was deep mocking, and a few students joined in, glancing at Claire's faded clothes. She didn't respond, but her fingers brushed the edge of her bag, where a faint scar ran across her knuckles, barely visible, but suddenly noticeable. "I'm here now," she said, her voice quiet but steady, like she was anchoring herself to the ground. The man's grin faded, and he shifted uncomfortably, like he'd expected her to crumble. Claire set her bag down again, this time with a little more care, like it held something fragile. She straightened up and looked at the woman, her eyes calm but piercing. "I'm not here to break anything," she said. "I just asked for one move." The woman scoffed, but her arms dropped a little, like she wasn't sure what to do with that. Mike, the instructor, wasn't letting it go. "You've got the wrong room, sweetheart. This isn't a place for street brawls. We've got rules here." He pointed at a sign on the wall. "Respect. Discipline. Control." One of the older students, a guy with a graying beard and a black belt knotted tight, leaned forward. "Wait a second," he said almost to himself. That's a guard stance. Classical, nobody teaches that anymore." His voice had a hint of awe, like he'd just seen a ghost. Mike turned to him, frowning. "What are you talking about, Tom?" The older guy, Tom, kept staring at Claire. "That stance? It's old school. Like pre-MMA. My sensei used it back in the 90s, but he said it was outdated even then." Claire's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "I learned it from someone who's gone," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried like she was speaking to everyone and no one at the same time. The room shifted again, like the air had gotten heavier. Mike's frown deepened. "Who taught you? Where'd you train?" He was trying to sound tough, but there was a crack in his confidence, like he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. A middle-aged woman, her guy slightly too tight, pushed through the crowd, her face flushed with indignation. "You think you can just waltz in here and show off?" She snapped, her voice loud enough to echo off the walls. "This is a serious place, not some stage for your little act." She gestured at Claire's worn-out sweatpants, her nose wrinkling like she'd smelled something bad. "Look at you. You don't belong here." Claire's hand paused on her bag, and for a moment her shoulders tensed, like she was carrying something heavier than canvas. "Belonging's not about what you wear," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper, but it silenced the woman mid-breath. The room felt smaller, like Claire's words had sucked out the extra space. Jason was back on his feet now, a towel pressed to his nose. His eyes were red and his ego was clearly bruised, worse than his face. "Don't worry," he said, his voice loud enough to cut through the tension. "I'll go easy this time. Gotta keep her neck intact." He cracked his knuckles, playing it up for the crowd. The students laughed again, but it was forced, like they were trying to convince themselves this was still a joke. Jason stepped onto the mat, towering over Claire. He smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You sure you don't need insurance, sweetheart?" Claire didn't blink. She just bowed her head slightly, a gesture so small it was almost invisible. "You should wear a mouth guard," she said. Her voice was calm, like she was reminding him to tie his shoes. The student snickered, thinking she was out of her depth. Jason laughed a big fake laugh and spread his arms wide. "All right, let's make this quick. I'll let you touch me, then I'll toss you." He winked at the crowd, and a few people clapped, egging him on. What happened next was over in half a second. Jason raised his hand, maybe to grab her, maybe to push her back. Claire didn't wait. She stepped forward, closing the gap so fast it was like she'd teleported. Her elbow snapped up, catching him square on the nose, same spot as before. The crack was loud, like a branch snapping. Jason hit the mat hard, blood streaming down his face again. This time he didn't get up. The room was dead silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. A girl in the back with a high bun and a nervous habit of chewing her thumbnail stammered, "That was a close combat damage strike." Her voice shook like she couldn't believe she'd said it out loud. Mike whipped around, his face pale. "What did you just say?" The girl shrank back but kept going. "It's a military thing. I read about it. You aim for the shock point. It's not something you learn in a dojo." Her words hung there, and the room started to buzz again, but this time it was different, less mocking, more uneasy. An older man stepped forward, his gi crisp, his black belt worn and faded. He was the master, the one who'd been watching quietly from the side. His name was Sensei Harada, and his face was hard, like he'd seen things he didn't talk about. "That strike," he said, his voice low and steady, "is banned in competition. It's too dangerous." He looked at Claire, not angry, but like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Who are you to use that move?" Another coach, a stocky guy with a clipboard, chimed in. "We don't tolerate violence outside the rules here. You can't just..." Claire cut him off, not by raising her voice, but by speaking so clearly it stopped the room. "I don't fight to win," she said. "I fought to survive." Her words landed like a punch, and for a moment, nobody knew what to say. The girl with the high bun whispered to the person next to her, "Is she military?" The question floated unanswered, but it changed the air. People started looking at Claire differently, like they were seeing her for the first time. A young guy with a buzz cut and a cocky grin pushed forward, his GI untied, like he didn't care about the rules. "You're just showing off," he said, his voice loud and brash. "What, you think you're better than us because you got a lucky hit?" He stepped closer, too close, his breath hot with anger. "This isn't your playground." Claire's eyes met his, and for a split second, her hand twitched like she was ready to move. But she didn't. Instead, she tilted her head just enough to make him feel small. "I'm not playing," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. But it made him step back, his bravado crumbling like dry leaves. Mike, still clutching his clipboard like a shield, stepped closer. "We need to see your ID," he said, his voice tight. "You can't just walk in here, do that, and expect us to let it slide." Sensei Harada nodded, but his eyes were softer now, like he was starting to understand something. Claire didn't argue. She reached into her bag, pulled out a worn leather wallet, and handed over a card. Mike took it, his hand shaking just a little. He read it, then passed it to Harada. The old master's eyes widened just for a second before he handed it back. One of the coaches, a younger guy with a buzz cut and a laptop, was already typing. "Hang on," he said, his voice urgent. "I've got something." He turned the screen toward Harada, and the old man leaned in. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the laptop fan. Claire Evans, the coach, read aloud. "Ghost Viper roster 2016. Only one trainee survived the real combat phase." He paused, his voice dropping. "She vanished from records in 2020. Note says, no public contact." A murmur ran through the room. A martial arts professor, a wiry woman with glasses who'd been observing from the back, stepped forward. "Ghost Viper," she said almost to herself. She's a living legend." Her voice was hushed, like she was afraid to say it too loud. Harada bowed to Claire, a deep, respectful bow, not like the ones he gave his students. "We didn't know," he said. "We're sorry." The words were simple, but they carried weight, like he was speaking for everyone in the room. The mood shifted, but not everyone was ready to let it go. A student, a guy with a shaved head and a chip on his shoulder, shouted, "Then why are you here? What do you want?" His voice was sharp, like he was trying to claw back some control. The woman with the blonde highlights muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Nobody invited her." Claire didn't flinch. She looked at them, her eyes steady, unblinking. "I'm just looking for someone," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise like a knife. A quiet student who'd been standing in the shadows, his GUI too big for his skinny frame, stepped forward nervously. You're not supposed to be here," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "This is a safe space. We don't need whatever you are." His words were clumsy, but they stung like a kid trying to sound tough, but hitting a nerve. Claire's jaw tightened just for a moment, and she adjusted her bag, her fingers brushing an old keychain, a tiny metal star dented and worn. "Safe's not what you think it is," she said, her voice low like she was speaking from a memory. The boy shrank back, his face red, and the room felt colder, like her words had stolen the warmth. Mike, still holding the clipboard, tried to keep his authority. "Who?" he asked, his tone demanding but shaky. Claire's hand went to her bag again. She pulled out a photo, creased and faded like it had been carried for years. She held it up just long enough for the room to see. It was a group shot, a special ops team in tactical gear, faces serious but proud. Jason was in it, younger, leaner, under a different name, his call sign printed clearly below. Claire's voice was steady, almost too calm. "You're the one who unlocked the base doors at Langley." The room gasped like the air had been sucked out. A student, a quiet guy who had been hanging back, whispered, "That breach. It killed 6 people." His voice cracked like he was remembering something he'd only read about. Claire nodded just once. "I'm not here for revenge," she said. "I'm here to prove I survived." Her words were soft, but they hit like a hammer. Jason, still on the ground, didn't move. His towel was soaked with blood, and his eyes were wide, like he was seeing his past catch up with him. A woman with a sharp bob and a clipboard of her own, probably an assistant coach, stepped forward, her voice trembling with outrage. "You think you can just accuse people like that?" she said, pointing at the photo. "You come in here, attack our best fighter, and now you're throwing around stories. That's low." The room murmured in agreement, some students nodding their faces hard. Claire didn't look at her. She folded the photo carefully, tucking it back into her bag, her movements slow like she was handling something sacred. "It's not a story," she said, her voice steady but heavy like it carried the weight of years. The woman's mouth opened, then closed, her clipboard lowering as the room's anger faltered. The dojo manager, a nervous guy with thinning hair, stepped forward, his hands trembling. "We don't allow people like you here," he said, his voice loud but unsteady. He grabbed a clipboard and crossed out Claire's name from the registration list, like that would erase what had just happened. A police officer in training, who'd been watching from the side, rested his hand on his gun, not drawing it, but making sure everyone saw. The room was tense like it was about to snap. Claire didn't react. She just looked at them, her face calm, her bag back on her shoulder. Then she turned and walked toward the door. As Claire reached the door, a man in his 50s with a weathered face and a limp pushed off the wall where he'd been leaning. "You're trouble," he said, his voice gruff like he'd smoked too many cigarettes. "People like you bring chaos wherever you go." He pointed at her bag, his finger shaking slightly. "What else you got in there?" "A bomb." The accusation was absurd, but it landed hard, the room's tension spiking. Claire stopped her hand on the doorframe and turned just enough to meet his eyes. "Just memories," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the hum of the air conditioner. The man's finger dropped, and he looked away like he'd seen something in her eyes he couldn't handle. The students parted as she moved like they were afraid to get in her way. The air outside was cold, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. Claire stepped into the darkness, her sneakers quiet against the ground. Behind her, the dojo was silent, except for the faint sound of Jason's labored breathing. Nobody helped him up. Nobody spoke. The weight of what had happened settled over the room like dust. Then a voice broke the silence. A female student, small with short hair and a medic's patch on her gi, ran to the door. "Wait," she called out. Claire stopped her back still to the dojo, her silhouette framed by the streetlight. The girl's voice was shaky but clear. "I was a medic at Langley," she said. "You saved me from the PMC soldiers. You saved 12 lives that day." Her words trembled like she'd been holding them in for years. "They forgot. But I didn't." Claire didn't turn around. She stood there, her shoulders still, her bag hanging low. The girl's voice grew softer. "You're the reason we're still alive." The words hung in the air, heavy and true. Inside the dojo, the students were quiet, their heads bowed like they were finally understanding. Jason stayed on the ground, his face pale, his past laid bare. The manager looked away, his clipboard forgotten. The police officer's hand dropped from his gun. A faint sound came from Claire's bag as she stood in the doorway, a soft jingle like metal against metal. The medic's eyes caught it and her breath hitched. It was a dog tag, half tucked into a side pocket, glinting faintly under the streetlight. Nobody else noticed, but the medic's hands shook as she clasped them together like she was praying. "You carried them all?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "You carried their names." Claire's head tilted slightly, not quite a nod, but enough to acknowledge the truth. The room felt smaller, like the weight of those names filled every corner. Days later, the consequences started to roll in. Jason was let go from the dojo, his name stripped from the roster. A local news outlet picked up the story, not about Claire, but about the man who'd betrayed his team. His sponsors dropped him, his social media accounts went dark, and his old MMA buddies stopped returning his calls. The blonde woman with the highlights tried to post a snarky comment online, but it backfired. Her followers turned on her, calling her out for piling on someone who didn't deserve it. The dojo itself took a hit. Students stopped showing up, and the manager's nervous apologies didn't help. The teenage girl who'd tried to film Jason's fall deleted her video that night, her hands shaking as she did it. She posted an apology online, instead admitting she'd been caught up in the moment, mocking someone she didn't understand. It got a few likes, but mostly people moved on. The man in the tailored jacket, the sponsor, stopped showing up at the dojo. Word spread that he had lost a major deal when his company's board caught wind of his behavior. Nobody said it out loud, but the connection was clear. His words to Claire had cost him more than he'd expected. Claire didn't stay to watch it unfold. She was already gone, moving through the world like she always had, quiet, unnoticed, carrying her truth in her steps. Her husband arrived the next day, a man with broad shoulders and a face that didn't need to speak. He walked into the dojo, and the room changed. Nobody said his name, but they knew. The manager stammered, the instructor looked away, and the students shuffled their feet. Claire stood beside him, not leaning on him, not needing to. Her presence was enough. The medic, the one who'd spoken up, watched from the back. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. She just nodded like she was saying thank you one last time. Claire's husband put a hand on her shoulder, a small gesture, but it said everything. They walked out together into the evening light, leaving the dojo behind. The silence they left was louder than any words. As they stepped onto the street, a young boy no older than 10, who'd been watching from the dojo's window, ran out after them. He clutched a crumpled piece of paper, a drawing of a woman in a hoodie standing tall on a mat. "This is you," he said, shoving it into Claire's hands, his voice small but fierce. "I saw what you did. You're like a superhero." Claire looked at the drawing, her fingers tracing the shaky lines, and for the first time, her lips curved into something close to a smile. She handed it back gently and said, "Keep it. Draw your own hero someday." The boy beamed, clutching the paper like a treasure as she walked away. Nobody forgot that day. Nobody forgot her. Claire Evans, the woman who walked in with a faded hoodie and a frayed bag, who stood her ground without raising her voice, who carried her scars like they were medals. She didn't need to prove anything. The proof was in the way the room changed, the way the truth came to light, the way the world shifted just a little because she'd been there. Sometimes you don't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes you just need to stand still. Let the world catch up. Let the truth do the talking. And when it does, it's louder than anything. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.